Hello and welcome to this new video on the long-term reading project of Thomas Mann's novel The Magic Mountain. You can find all previous videos in this. In the last video we covered the first 3 episodes of the 7th chapter, By the Ocean of Time, with its reflections on time, and then the introduction of this imposing character of Mynheer Peeperkorn, and then the intoxicating bacchanal in the episode back there. And today we continue with the next 3 episodes of the 7th chapter, the episodes with the title Mynheer Peeperkorn Continued, Mynheer Peeperkorn Conclusion, and finally The Great God Dumps. As far as I understand the structure of the novel, these 3 episodes form sort of a conclusion to the Peeperkorn storyline, of course, but also a conclusion to Hans Castorp's educational project, if you want to call it like that. And at the end of these 3 episodes, there is a clear milestone in a negative sense. So Hans is left pretty much alone. He is without a mentor, without a lover, without a purpose of life. What remains is what Thomas Mann calls the dead life. As usual, my video is structured into several chapters, and I'll briefly show the overview here, and then you can select all the chapters individually by using the timestamps given. Okay, let's start as usual with a brief overview of the plot. What happens here? Let's go through it episode by episode. So in this episode, Mynheer Peeperkorn continued. The relationship between Hans, Clawdia, and Peeperkorn intensifies. We witness 3 key conversations between these 3 people. The first one is between Hans and Clawdia, and the other 2 are between Hans and Mynheer Peeperkorn. And the first conversation with Peeperkorn shortly after the bacchanal in Bengtong, that is about illness, about medicine, about poison, and more on that poison theme later. Then the conversation that follows is the one with Clawdia, and that takes place in sort of an intimate atmosphere. Again, this kind of armchair or rocking chair conversation in a passageway in some of the public areas of the Berghof. So I think this is clearly mirroring some crucial conversations scenes in earlier episodes. So they talk about their relationship, and Clawdia asks Hans for his friendship, not for his own sake, but for Peeperkorn's sake. So she is worried about the aging man, and she wants Hans to help her, support him, protect him from doing this excesses, probably like the bacchanal with all this drinking. The second conversation then with Peeperkorn is truly remarkable, I think. So Hans visits the sick Dutch man at his bedside, and what unfolds there is a kind of a confession and a reconciliation at the same time. So Peeperkorn confronts Hans with his suspicion or his knowledge of Hans' romantic feelings for Clawdia, or even their love affair. And Hans, he doesn't deny it. He confesses, and instead of the expected confrontation, what happens is something different. Peeperkorn offers him sort of a friendship, and he offers him the informal, familiar form of addressing each other. So this may need some explanation, because some English readers may not be familiar with the fact that in German there are 2 different ways to address a person. So the more formal one is addressing the person in the 3rd person plural. And the more informal and more familiar one is the one using the 2nd person singular. And shifting from one form address to the other, in particular 100 years ago, that was a big deal. It was something that really had to be offered in an almost ceremonial way by the older person, or by the person that was of higher social standing, to the other one. And it was very common to seal this also with a drink. to celebrate this. So this is what happens here. So the two rivals, Peeperkorn offers to shift to the informal form of address. It's a sort of almost a fraternization, formation of a brotherhood sealed with a drink, and this I think psychologically highly interesting and also somewhat bizarre. Interwoven into this plot of this first episode we are talking about today is also one of the usual debates between Settembrini and NAFTA. And this time it's about the role of the church and religion in general, in particular with regards to the revolution, to societal change. It's a conversation that takes place in the presence of Mynheer Peeperkorn, and strangely enough, it comes to nothing. So we'll talk about it again also in detail later. And then the episode Mynheer Peeperkorn end. In this episode, it starts with a rather idyllic scene. A small group takes a trip to a waterfall in the mountains. It's now May, so springtime even in the mountains. Nature is awakening. Meltwater is rushing down the mountain streams. And Peeperkorn stages one last great appearance on his stage. So at the waterfall, he gives a speech. But ironically, the roar of the water completely drowns out his words. So, and he is doing very pompous things. So, with the gesture reminiscent of a high priest. So he swings a wine goblet and he empties it, and no one understands what he is saying. But it's really a silent speech. It's a pantomime. That's the effect on the others, and yet everyone is spellbound by it. And so this really was the grand finale of Mynheer Peeperkorn, because on the night after this excursion, he takes his own life. He uses a sophisticated poison device to commit suicide. So he's found dead in the early hours of the morning, and Clawdia allows Hans to finally give her the kiss on the forehead that he had refused at the end of the Bacchanal, and then she leaves a few days later, and this time for good. And then the third episode, the Great Dullness, or the Great Goddams. So after Peeperkorn's death and Clawdia's departure, Hans is left alone, and what follows is a period of complete stagnation. The narrator calls it the Great Dullness or the Great Goddams. So it's a life without time, a life without hope, without meaning, without any aim or ambition. So Hans no longer has a reason to exist at the Berghof. So no lover, no real mentor that he does accept. So even his illness is denied him. So at least in a sense. So Hofer appearance has suddenly diagnosis now, your tuberculosis is completely healed, if it ever was tuberculosis at all. Okay, so maybe you have some streptococcus infection instead of tuberculosis. Much more simpler affair. But at least it's a reason or a justification to stay a bit longer at the Berghof. So Hans and the other Berghof patients, they take refuge in meaningless hobbies, photography, card games, the lawyer, paramount, or public prosecutor. It's precisely his job description. So he becomes even more obsessed with this pursuit of squaring the circle, a mathematically unsolvable problem. And so the Berghof as a whole falls into kind of a collective frenzy, or no, it's more a collective lethargy, interrupted only occasionally by some fads, by some hobby that is very interesting for a couple of days and weeks, and everyone goes for it, and then it fades away. So this is, as the narrator calls it, it's dead life. Okay, let's take a closer look at these episodes and the topics and themes that are discussed here. So my first point here, and it's the third chapter of this video, is the love triangle. Let's take a look at this. And so what an interesting transformation of jealousy into something else we can observe here. So I think this is a central theme of these, at least of the first two episodes, is this transformation of this love triangle between Hans, Clawdia, and Peeperkorn. And what begins as a classic rivalry situation turns into something completely different, something really unexpected. Let's remember, when Peeperkorn arrived with Clawdia at the Berghof, Hans was bitterly disappointed. He had daydreamed about his reunion with Clawdia. He had imagined it to be very, very different, and now instead he is ignored. He is sidelined. He's overshadowed by this imposing old man who's not only imposing but maybe also an imposter. And the natural reaction would be jealousy, resentment, perhaps even hatred of his rival. But that's not what happens. Instead, Hans develops a kind of fascination for Peeperkorn, and which eventually turns into real, genuine admiration. So he cannot escape this man's charisma, even though, or perhaps precisely because, Peeperkorn embodies everything that Hans is not, cannot be: physical presence, full physical presence, vitality, and an almost majestic charisma. And yeah, this transformation of Hans' feelings towards Peeperkorn, this culminates in the conversations in these episodes. So Hans forms an alliance with Clawdia, an alliance that is no longer based on eros, but on a kind of caring, on charity. And so she asks him for help for Peeperkorn, and Hans agrees. So he becomes an ally of the woman he loves, but he becomes an ally not as her lover, but as a co-caregiver for a third party, for her true and real lover. And then he forms a brotherhood with Peeperkorn himself. So, and this is also remarkable, I think. The rival, the man who took Clawdia away from him, he becomes almost his brother. So they're forming this brotherhood, this alliance of people who address each other each other by their first name and address each other in the second person singular. So Hans confesses his feelings. Peeperkorn accepts this confession, and instead of any conflict, this strange alliance is formed. So there are two. So we have two alliances here, and more or less a double alliance. And so with Clawdia, it's sort of a purified relationship that is no longer erotic, but characterized by kind of charity. And so the passion has not disappeared completely, but it has been transformed into something else. And with Peeperkorn, it's a male friendship, a sort of a brotherhood or fraternity that transcends rivalry has been formed. So Hans submits, in a sense, to Peeperkorn's majesty. He even addresses him as such in the previous episode. And the interesting thing is that in both cases, the actual focus of the alliance that is formed is not the person with whom Hans forms the alliance, but it's always an alliance formed for the benefit of a third person, or with a perspective on a third person, founded on the relationship to a third person. So a third party. He allies himself with Clawdia for Peeperkorn's sake, and he allies himself with Peeperkorn via Clawdia. So they even call her our lover. So it's strange, but in both cases, the object of concern or admiration is not a direct member of the alliance, but it's the third party. Okay. At this point, I would like to insert a thought that is not my own observation, but that I picked up from the academic literature that is commenting and analyzing the Magic Mountain. Some professional literary critics and commentaries, they read this transformation of the love triangle as the concrete realization of Hans' insight in the snow episode. You may recall that in the snow episode, which we discussed in a previous video, Hans arrived at the end at this key sentence, printed also in italics, I think, in the novel. I'm not quoting verbatim, but I'm paraphrasing here. So, for the sake of goodness and love, man should not allow death to rule his thoughts. Something along that line. And there also develops this idea of the human being as a homo dei, the man of God, the human being who stands between the extremes and mediates between them. In some commentaries of the Magic Mountain now, they argue that this is precisely what Hans puts into practice here. So this transformation from erotic jealousy that might lead to death into an alliance based on charity, on caritas. That is charity and care. So that is the realization of this insight. So this triangle, Hans, Clawdia, Peeperkorn, thus embodies a new, a life-affirming concept of humanity. No longer this death-obsessed nature of erotic obsession, but a form of love that overcomes death by turning to life. So whether this is really the intention of the narrator of Hans, whether Hans consciously implements this insight, or whether it simply happens and it's coincidental that this mirrors some aspects of the snow episode, I don't know. But I think it's an interesting thought that nicely bridges the gap between the snow episode and what happens here. Another structural observation that struck me is the conversation between Hans and Clawdia takes place again in this particular spatial configuration, these armchair conversations that I already mentioned in previous videos, that always take place not in a closed room, but in a situation in a passageway between two different rooms in this public area of the Berghof, behind the pillar in the end, in where the passageway to the music room or the piano room or the reading room is. So now again we have the situation in the exact same type of spot. Hans is sitting in a rocking chair and Clawdia stands at first and leans towards him, and this is really reminiscent of a couple of earlier scenes in the novel. On Walpurgis night, this confidential conversation in French between Hans and Clawdia took place in a plush-covered armchair in a sheltered corner near the passageway, or near the door to the room next door. Then there was also such an armchair scene in the passageway between Joachim and Marussia. So on the final evening when Joachim was not yet on his deathbed. So Marussia sits there and Joachim stands behind her and leans over her from behind. And the first conversation between Hans and Clawdia after her return also took place in this sort of setting. So this quote, clarifying the big relationship questions while sitting in an armchair in a passageway, unquote. This seems to be both a symbolic thing, or it seems to be a leitmotif in this novel. So the interesting conversations that really touch deeply the fundamentals of this romantic relationship, they always take place in this setting. So, okay, fourth chapter, poison and healing, and also a short digression on the mystification of nature here. Before we come to the end of Peeperkorn, I would like to insert this small thematic digression, because I think it's important for understanding these episodes and why the motive of poison is inserted here, and why Peeperkorn talks so much about poison. So in this episode, Mynheer Peeperkorn continued. It's striking that Peeperkorn, who doesn't seem to care about detailed facts and knowledge from dictionaries a lot, but there's one exception. He seems to now have a conspicuous interest in poison, and he seems to know a lot of scientific hard facts about it. So he has done his homework on this topic. In his conversation with Hans, he raves about exotic poisons from the tropics, the snake venoms, and the effects of various substances on the human body. And this is not just small talk. I think it's not by random that Thomas Mann included this topic here. I think it is also a foreshadowing his death by poison. But it's also more than that. I think this fascination with poison fits into a larger theme that runs through the entire novel, and this is the question of avoiding the harmful effect of going to the extremes. There's a famous quote attributed to the physician and alchemist Paracelsus, and it goes like this, more or less: all things are poison, and nothing is without poison. Only the dose makes a thing not a poison. Or more succinctly, the dose makes the poison. And this is not an outdated statement. This is very true. Every physician, every doctor, every toxicologist knows this and will subscribe to this. So I think this idea that the dose decides whether something has a harmful effect, no effect, or even a healing effect. That really depends on the dose. And I think this idea seems to be significant for the Magic Mountain as well as a whole. So think of the various substances, or let's call it influences and life ingredients to which Hans is exposed at the Berghof. And it's the mountain air, actually healing, but in too large a dose, it can be exhausting, numbing, and paralyzing. This is what Hans experienced in the very beginning of the novel, when he, on his first excursion up into the mountain, he went too quickly, too high, and then he had his nose bleeding and was dizzy and had to lie down on a bench. And the ideologies of Settembrini, there's a grain of salt in each of it. And if you take it not just with a grain of salt, it could be stimulating in moderation. But the way it is always driven to the extreme by these two combatants, it's overdose, then it's confusing and it's corrosive and it's destructive. Or Hans' love for Clawdia, it could be invigorating, but for him, this of 1 year after she left, she's still carrying her X-ray image close to the heart. That's very consuming. It's not a healthy form of admiration and love. Or the mountain retreat, the Berghof itself. It's a place that's supposed to be a healing, but for a couple of people like Hans, who it becomes a trap. So because they do not come to an end there and return, but they are trapped there in this excessive loop of prolonging their stay on and on. So everything can heal and everything can also harm. It depends on the dose, on the amount, on the circumstances, and on the constitution of the person taking it. And I think this is a more general, abstract theme in this novel. The narrator is always showing that it's not good to go to the extreme in anything. And so this poison thing, and he's talking about that some poison substances like quinine can be a very powerful pharmaceutical, but also can have toxic effects as well. So, and what I found particularly interesting about this theme is that by harping on about this, Thomas Mann is also criticizing or undermining a certain romantic idealization of nature that was also in fashion in this interwar period in the early 1920s. There was also this idea prevalent also still today, that natural is synonymous with good or healthy. And it seems to be obviously true, but it's not true. It's nonsense. I'll explain later. So Peeperkorn, also this apostle of life and natural pleasures, he dies from a natural substance, from a natural poison, so snake venom. So we see clearly nature is not only a source of life. Not everything that is natural is healthy, is good. It can also be a source of death. Arsenic is natural. The death cap mushroom is natural. Cholera and tuberculosis, they're natural, but they kill people. So this is typical of Thomas Mann's ironic worldview. He never fully leans into one side when it comes to worldview. So it's not a simple, stupid glorification of nature. No, nature can be very harmful. Also, Peeperkorn's vitalism, this celebration of life and of natural forces, it's not neither simply affirmed nor denied. It is shown in all its ambivalence, and the poison that kills Peeperkorn is, in a sense, just the dark side of the very nature that he worshipped. Okay, let's move on to the 5th chapter and the debate, Church and Revolution and Religion. So there's another debate between Settembrini and NAFTA, so no chapter without it. And this is interwoven into the Peeperkorn plot, and this conversation deserves special attention, not only because of its content, but also because of its function in context. So let's take a look at what are the positions here advocated for by Settembrini and NAFTA. I will try to summarize shortly. So Settembrini's position is, so the church is and has always been hostile to progress. It stands in the way of the Settembrini calls it the Luciferian revolution. And Luciferian does not mean anything devilish, satanic in the bad sense, but in the literal sense, Luciferish, so light bearing. So it refers to the enlightenment, of course, the liberation of the human spirit by the light of reason. And so the church, according to Settembrini, is none of that. On the contrary, he thinks that the church always promotes barbarism and immaturity. And he deepens the cut. He says, that despite its spiritual facade, the church is ultimately totally materialistic because it strives for worldly power. It cares more about the quantity of souls that belong to the church, but because they can also give their wealth to the church, of course. And Sam NAFTA's position is, but no, the church is the most revolutionary force of all. Its goal is a communist theocracy and a total upheaval of the existing order. And also he points out that church law, the so-called canon law, is remarkably free of prejudice, for example, with regard to the status of people according to their birth. So it's irrelevant of whether they were born a slave or a nobleman. So the church is open for all and doesn't care about these things. And there's this Christian religious concept of indulgence, of forgiveness, remission, being lenient with the weakness of people. So I think he says that this demonstrates a flexible, pragmatic, and very humanistic attitude of the church. So at the first glance, this later part might look a bit confusing because it turns around the usual classifications of NAFTA. So Settembrini, the progressive one, criticizes the church as reactionary. Okay, that fully makes sense. That's his usual song. And NAFTA, the reactionary, he now praises the church as revolutionary. So that it seems to be a bit odd, a bit counterintuitive. And if you take a closer look at it, again, as I mentioned earlier, there's a grain of salt in everything that they say. Both are right in their own way, partly, maybe 10% or 25% are right, but both are also wrong in their own way, in the way that they push their position to the extremes. And yeah, let's try to put this into a larger context. If you have seen my video on the previous episode, on the episode Operationes Spirituales, you may remember this table in which I compared Settembrini's and NAFTA's position on various topics in a systematic way, so that we could better keep track of the fundamental differences between these two adversaries and have the full picture at one glance. And because you can easily get lost in the heat of the moment of their debates. And so here's this table again for reference, and now I've supplemented a 10th point based on the topics of this conversation here. So topic 10, the role of the church and of religion. So Settembrini, in short, again, religion and church reactionary, hostile to progress, opposed to the Enlightenment, promote barbarism, ultimately materialistic. And NAFTA says, no, religion and church are the most revolutionary force, have the goal of communist theocracy, is completely free from prejudice, and he points out this concept of indulgence, this forbearance with human weakness and human fallibility. Okay, so that's, I think, completes a bit the picture of how different these two people are, who both want to be accepted as Hans' mentors. Um, what? Let's talk about the function and the reason for including this debate here. I think this is now comes. The crucial point is that this debate takes place in the presence of Mynheer Peeperkorn, and what happens here, that is very telling, because nothing happens. It comes to nothing. Even more blatantly than the previous debate, in which Hans and Joachim simply left, the two debaters left the table. Here, the non-reaction is even more evident. So Peeperkorn, he does not physically leave the conversation. He stays there listening, or not listening at all. We don't know. But all the astute arguments of these two intellectuals, of these master speakers trained in rhetorics, it all rolls off him like water off a Teflon-coated pan. He probably doesn't even understand what it's all about, or if he does understand, he doesn't care at all. And the amazing thing is, so it doesn't, all what they discuss and explain, it doesn't matter at all. And his mere presence, his charisma, his personality, to use a term that the novel itself uses repeatedly, that still outshines everything else, and it completely stifles all this intellectual brilliance. It leads to nothing. It leads nowhere. So so he nullifies everything. So and I think that this fits perfectly to how the narrator describes Peeperkorn. At one point, he calls him the stately zero. So it's a null, a stately non-entity, nothing. So or someone who nullifies everything. So this is a wonderful paradox. So he is completely empty in terms of content. He has no intellectual arguments at all, no sophisticated ideology, but it is precisely this voidness, this emptiness, that makes him unassailable. So Settembrini's and Nafter's arguments, they do not resonate with him because he does not operate at that level at all. And so everything they say, it drops dead to the ground. And I think that Thomas Mann is showing something, is doing this very intentionally here, and also linked to the Peeperkorn theme. We remember that Peeperkorn is all about his fear of impotence, and Thomas Mann is also touching the impotence topic here. It's the impotence of the intellect and the impotence of the intellectual here. All the ideological truth, it doesn't matter, or at least it has no power, it has no effect. So the two great orators who argue so eloquently about God and the world and everything, they suddenly appear to be completely powerless, impotent. So Peeperkorn only has to sit there and remain silent, and still he dominates the situation, and he cancels everything, cancels the effect or the meaning of everything they say. So this is, of course, also I think it's an ironic reflection, or a sort of symmetry Thomas Mann is using here, a reflection of Peeperkorn's own physical impotence, his physical and sexual weakness, a thing that he's most afraid of, which is repeatedly hinted at in these episodes, and then Settembrini and Nafta also, in a way, impotence. So both forms of power, intellectual power and physical, vitalistic power, they prove to be very limited, vulnerable, and ultimately they can fail. That, for me, is one of the important structural functions of this debate here in this episode. Okay, let's come to the climax, as I see it. So the silent speech at the waterfall and Peeperkorn's end. The trip to the waterfall and the death of this colonial Dutchman of slightly colored nationality. It's May. Nature is awakening. Spring arrives in the mountain, and a small group takes an idyllic trip to a waterfall in the mountain. So the scenery is described in detail, the roaring water, the spray, the overwhelming forces of nature. It is a setting that suits Peeperkorn, so the forces of the elements, powerful, far beyond what humans can achieve. And then there's the scene at the waterfall itself, so where Peeperkorn gives a speech, and he stands there, making all his grand gestures, moving his lips, But no one hears what he says. The roar of the water drowns out his words. And I think this is significant on so many levels. So, like he nullified all that had been said by Settembrini and after by his silence. Now the noise silences him, and it nullifies everything that he has to say. And what he's doing there, this speech that is cannot be heard. It's I think this is the culmination of what he has been doing all along. He has never really spoken coherent sentences. He has never said anything that people could really make sense of. So his speeches have always been more gesture and performance than content. And now this is taken to the extreme. Pure gesture, zero content, and at least zero comprehensible content. And and that's one aspect. And the second is the confrontation with nature. So Peeperkorn, again, this links back to the dualistic nature of nature. So Peeperkorn is the worshipper of life, of nature, the champion of natural forces. He stands now here before a force of nature that is stronger than him. So it silences him, and or at least it renders his speech completely irrelevant. So nature does not respond, it does not listen, it is completely indifferent, even towards the most powerful, the most impressive human beings. Nature is not impressed at all. So, and thirdly, as again in the way he's described was doing there with emptying this goblet of wine or chalice of wine, this is, I think this again resonates with these Christological and Dionysian motives that we already observed in the Bacchanal in the episode 21. This shines through here again. So this wine offering at the waterfall. So Peeperkorn empties this cup or chalice with a ritual gesture. So he empties it to the bottom, I think, and at least in German, empty the chalice to the bottom. It's also a figure of speech. This is something like carried on towards the end, to the extreme, really to the end point. So, and the way he does this is it's performed like a sacred gesture, like echoes of religious rituals, as has been also the celebration of the Bacchanal in episode 21. Yeah, and then death comes in the night. So in the night after this outing, Peeperkorn takes his own life. He uses this mechanical poison injection instrument that was probably procured for him by his servant. I think that is also just a minute detail that underlines this colonial, exotic dimension of his character. So this colonial Dutchman from Java, he dies from a poison from the tropics, from also applied by a technology that does not originate from European culture and mechanics. So why does he do it? So the text suggests that it is the fear of failure, the fear of no longer being able to meet the sacred demands of life. So we have already heard this in the Bacchanal, this fear of impotence, of declining strength. It would be the greatest defeat, almost something like Doomsday, Judgment Day, not to be able to satisfy life like this sprawled woman. So in a way, suicide is the logical solution within Peeperkorn's worldview. If life is the highest value, and if one can no longer do justice to life, to enjoying life, then continuing to life, in his logic, is a disgrace. And for him, it's better to go for an end with dignity, even if it is a self-inflicted, self-chosen end. But this is for him still better than an undignified decline and carrying on with a life that is not worth living, not worth to be lived anymore, and at least in his understanding. Again, I would like to add something that I picked up in the more academic literature on the Magic Mountain. That seems also to be sort of conclusive and interesting to me. Some authors emphasize that Peeperkorn's failure follows an inner logic. Okay, sure, it's not a coincidence. It follows a logic that we have already seen in the novel. It's this it's called the Einseitigkeitsthesis, so one-sidedness thesis or one-sidedness hypothesis. So the idea is that, as I mentioned also, so being one-sided, focusing on one extreme always leads to failure or to catastrophe. And I think it's a valid argument that the narrator has shown this using, in a systematic way, several examples. Think of Joachim Ziemßen. So Joachim was the exact opposite of Peeperkorn. He was disciplined, dutiful, ascetic, committed to the, committed to the Apollonian principle of order, measure, structure. He suppressed his feeling. He submitted to the military rules. He tried to control his body through his willpower, and he fails. His body did not function like that. The rebellio carnis, the rebellion of the flesh, that brought him back to the Berghof and finally caused his death. And Peeperkorn is the other extreme, completely devoted to the Dionysian principle, to intoxication, to pleasure, to physicality, the physical pleasures of life. And he suppresses nothing. He lives everything to the fullest. But again, like Joachim, he is exhausting the powers of his bodily powers. So he too fails due to the declining strength of his body, his inability to live up to his own ideas. So there is still this is a similarity, a parallel between Joachim and both fail and they die because of their inability to live up, because of their body's inability to live up to their own ideals. So this is nicely symmetrically built. And some commentaries of the Magic Mountain now argue that both Joachim and Peeperkorn fail due to their one-sidedness. Joachim by pure Apollonianism and Peeperkorn by pure Dionysianism. And only Hans Castorp, this mediocre one, survives. He survives perhaps precisely because he does not devote himself entirely to either extreme. Instead, he oscillates and mediates between the poles, and so he occupies this cozy intermediate position, and so he's the one who succeeds, and not in being happy, but at least he survives. Okay, so this is of course not a story of Hans as a hero. This is no hero's journey. Hans survives not because he is better or smarter, but he survives because he is less consistent. His mediocrity is his strong point. It's his protection. So what is called the ingenious path through death, it leads to life only if one does not go to the extremes. One last detail to conclude this Peeperkorn plot. After Peeperkorn's death, Clawdia finally allows Hans to kiss her on the forehead. So actually, it's not she's allowing him, but she had not refused. It was Hans who had refused to give this kiss previously at the end of the Bacchanal, but at that time Peeperkorn had asked him to do so, and Hans had refused, perhaps because he would have felt it as a betrayal. But now, after Peeperkorn's death, there's nothing in the way anymore. The kiss is possible, but it is a very peculiar sort of kiss. It is a death cult kiss, I'd call it. It's a farewell kiss. It's like the final seal on a closed file before it is stowed away. So Clawdia leaves. And this time for good, and what remains is just the memory, like in a sealed file document, sealed with a kiss and store away. So, and what remains is the great emptiness, or the great dullness, or in the translation I'm reading, that the translator used the title "The Great God Dumps." I'm not sure I completely understand what that means, but whatever. I would call it the great dullness or the great zero. So with Peeperkorn's death and Clawdia's departure, an important part of the plot ends, of course, but also an important phase in Hans Castorp's life comes to an end. And what now begins is called by the narrator this the great God Dumps, or the great dullness. Let's take a look at, let's make sort of a budget. Let's be clear about what Hans had lost at this point. He has lost his cousin Joachim Ziemßen, dead. His lover Clawdia, gone for good. His vitalistic teacher and almost brother Peeperkorn, dead by suicide. His intellectual mentors Settembrini and after still physically present, but they have become almost irrelevant to Hans. He doesn't accept them anymore as real authorities and mentors. So Hans has no one left. The entire educational project, if we want to call his stay at the Berghof like that way, the entire project has failed. He has learned a lot, of course. He has experienced a lot. He has gone through a lot, but in the end, he is left empty-handed. And it gets worse. Even his whole reason for being at the Berghof, his justification to be still there instead of working hard as an engineer in ship construction, even his illness, he has lost. No tuberculosis anymore, if he ever had any. So I mentioned that Dr. Behrens, he suddenly diagnoses that Hans no longer has tuberculosis, and so maybe he has something else that is responsible for his weakness, or that he feels bad. So maybe it's an infection by streptococci. Okay, let's give it a try. It's a very common thing. Every donkey has streptos, says Behrens in his typically casual manner, and so let's try this. So what is Hans supposed to do here now? He has no longer a clear medical indication and reason to stay here at the Berghof, no emotional reason, no mental reason, but he stays away here anyway, because where else could he go? The flatlands, the normal world, he would that has become really foreign to him. He's so alienated from normal life that this is not an option. So he wouldn't fit in there. So he stays at the Berghof without reason, without purpose, without hope. So Behrens' decision to diagnose Hans with streptococcus is more something probably out of pity, because Behrens is clever and sees that this Hans is inept for anything else in normal life. And on the other hand, it might also be motivated by economic consideration on his part. So a guest with such deep pockets is not easily let go. Interestingly, Hans' condition is also reflected in the overall atmosphere at the Berghof. It's not only Hans who falls into dullness. The whole society up there shows symptoms of this sort of dullness and disintegration. The end point seems to have been reached. I paraphrase from the text. So not only did Hans Castorp himself seem to have reached such a dead end, but it was as if the world, everything, the whole was in the same situation. End of quote. So the narrator also mentions the global political situation. This is one of the first instances where the global politics, apart from Settembrini's plans, comes into play. So the threat of war, the Balkan League that is forming there under the guidance of Russia, the tension between European powers. So now one is more inclined to see the Berghof as a microcosm of the world heading for disaster. Let's talk a little bit about what the people are doing there. And the narrator finds a coins of phrase here that I consider to be one of the key concepts of this episode. He says, life without time, life without care or hope, life is stagnant, dead life. He calls it dead life. I think this is a remarkable formulation. Dead life it's an oxymoron, of course, a contradiction in itself, in its terms. But I think that is very nicely describes Hans' condition. He is alive, but his life is dead. It's void. He exists, but he does not really live an active life. So I thought that also The Great Zero would make a perfect alternative title for this episode, because that is what is being described here, a zero point, a mental vacuum, an emptiness that no longer has any direction of goal. And when I read this part, a doubt crept into my mind. it was doubted. This, what Hans is doing here, it's also described as a living only, as living only in the moment. Isn't it the same thing that Peeperkorn exemplified and was always asking for? This is also a form of purely living in the here and now, only in the moment. So isn't it the same thing? And now but it seems to be it seems to be described in a very different way. And I think at second glance it becomes clear that there is a difference. It's not the same. It's similar but not the same. The narrator makes a subtle but important distinction here. There are apparently at least two different forms or different ways of living in the moment. And the contrast between Peeperkorn and Hans makes that clear. Let me try to explain the difference. Peeperkorn's present is Peeperkorn lives entirely in the present. He actively enjoys each and every moment. He celebrates the here and now. He demands complete devotion to the moment. This is what I described in the previous video as I think living in sync with time, a kind of active presence, a conscious engagement with what is happening right now, being so focused on what's happening in the moment that you don't care about the past and the future, just being in the here and now. So being in the here and now, one could describe this in modern terms as mindfulness, so the ability to be completely and fully present in what one is doing right now without being distracted by the past or the future. For Peeperkorn, this has almost religious dimensions. Enjoying the moment is a sacred duty, a conscious service to life itself. Today we call this mindfulness, also open with this sort of pseudo-religious undertone. And Hans, in this great dullness, he also lives in the moment, but in a completely different way. He drifts unconsciously, letting himself be carried along without a goal, without commitment. He is there, but he is not really present. He is not the one who is steering the ship of his attention and of his life. His time passes, but it is not lived actively. It's not fulfilled. He is just killing time with things that are not a real employment of life, but rather a mechanical distraction, trying to play solitaire 32 times in a row or waiting for a certain outcome. So this is not mindfulness, this is apathy. It's not an affirmation of life, it's a very dull form of existence. So he does not consciously ignore time, he has simply stopped caring about it. So the narrator would call this probably profligate time management in his own style. So there's a qualitative difference, and the difference is not whether one lives in the present or not, but it's about how one lives in the present, in the moment, with mindfulness, active attention, and filling your life with activities or pleasures, or with emptiness, killing time. So intensity or dullness, that's the choice. Devotion or indifference, that's the choice we have to make. So Peeperkorn, he does this, still he fails, but he fails spectacularly with after a life that he has emptied the goblet or the chalice to the ground, and he dies with one last grand gesture. Hans fails in this episode, and if he would be dying in this episode, it would be a rather pathetic thing, nothing like the grand gesture of Peeperkorn. His failure is a silent one. It's imperceptible, a creeping extinction. So the irony is that, again, Thomas Mann is a master of irony, is that both attitudes are ultimately both forms of avoidance. So they have something in common. Peeperkorn avoids reflection, avoids contemplation, avoids critical distance. And Hans avoids commitment, avoids decision-making, avoids responsibility. So neither of them finds the balance that has now been mentioned so often. Both of them, they go to extremes. Both of them don't find the balance that has been outlined in the Snow Dream episode as an ideal. So again, this motive of failure through one-sidedness, the failure through going to the extremes. let's take a closer look at what is described here, the hobbies or pastimes of this work of society. I think they are not picked they are not picked in a random way. I find they are quite symbolic in the way they are chosen and described by the narrator. So there's photography first. And I think photography, what is it all about? It is about freezing life in the moment, creating a static image of something that is going. So capturing moments in still images. It's a technology that freezes life, that is transforming movement into stillness. So it has two aspects. On the one hand, it's focusing on one single moment. So being in the moment is an element here, but it also fits perfectly with the oxymoron dead life. It is a rigid version of life. This snapshot of life. It's not live, not really living. It's something close to that. And the narrator also describes the photographs in an unhealthy way that makes you think of death. The people have ivory-colored faces. That makes me think of a death mask or of a corpse. The flowers are yellow flowers and a giftgrüne Wiese, a poisonous green meadow. So everything seems slightly unhealthy, slightly artificial, slightly dead in these pictures that are taken here. Then this card games, solitaire, I don't know, remember how it is translated. The German word is borrowed from the French and means patience. I think in English it's called solitaire. It's a card game that you play alone, a card game that depends more on chance and so which the player has very limited influence. It's an activity that fills time without accomplishing anything. And so you can't really control it. You let chance deal the cards. And there's also something, I think there's a metaphoric meaning in that. Or the pastime of the public prosecutor, Mr. Paravant, squaring the circle, a mathematically unsolvable problem. He spends hours and days trying to do something that by definition cannot be done. So, and that's not just stupidity. I think it's obsessive self-absorption, a form of mental self-mutilation. All these hobbies have something in common. They are activities without a clear goal, without an achievable goal. They are activities without meaning, pastimes without gain. They fill the void without overcoming it. Photography might be an exception, but it is described all these hobbies, they are just short periods where there's a frenzy for a couple of days about it and then it drops away. So there's no consistency in it. And so then also this productive creative hobby, it becomes something dead and fruitless. While reading this episode, I noticed an allusion that I believe to be intentional, and it's an allusion to this engraving by Dürer that was also mentioned in earlier episodes. I also mentioned and showed it in one of my videos. So this description of Mr. Paravant's melancholic and desperate search for a solution, how to mathematically square the circle. This reminds me of Albrecht Dürer's famous copperplate engraving, Melancholia 1 from 1514. We've already talked about this when we discussed the number 7, and magic squares and melancholy. And in this engraving, there's I show the engraving here. What's that? There's a winged female figure, probably personifying melancholy, who sits surrounded by all kinds of tools that most of them can very well be associated with the search for squaring the circle. Most of them are tools related to a geometrical work. So she sits in front of a square that is painted on a wall. So she has a compass in her hand, an instrument to draw circles. In front of her on the floor are mathematical geometric objects, such as a sphere, a globe, and a polyhedron. And in addition, there's also a power glass, and her gaze is melancholically directed into the void, into the great dullness. So for me, Paravant's the description of Paravant sitting desperately at the tables looking for a solution to square the circle, also with his string formed into a circle and then formed into a square. That, yeah, this evoked, for me, it evoked precisely the memory of this very engraving. So we know that Thomas Mann knew this, he liked this engraving, he described it in his notes, and it is clearly alluded to in previous chapters, so I think this is intentional here, that the activities of Paravant are described in that way, that are similar to the way that the person Melancholia is described in this engraving. So, yeah, I think the Berkhof is a place of melancholy, not of active grief, but there is a paralyzing gloom that stifles all drive. And I think that this makes perfect sense. After all we've observed about the impotence of the intellectual, this again fits well in here, because in the Renaissance and in the Baroque period, melancholy was considered particularly a disease of scholars and artists, a disease of those who think too much and act too little, so and become frozen and paralyzed in their brooding. So this fits public prosecutor Paravant, but it also fits Hans, who also is a person who thinks a lot, or at least who daydreams a lot, while he's actually doing very little in the active sense. Okay, let's move on to another point. I think that's the 10th point in my video. It's Hans' new attitude towards Settembrini. This struck me already in previous episodes, that the relationship between Hans and Settembrini was shifting, and now this change becomes even more obvious. So we had already seen some signs of it, but now it's becoming more apparent. In the earlier chapters of the novel, Hans was more or less a very docile student of Settembrini. He listened carefully. He allowed himself to be taught. He accepted not all, but many of the Italians' warnings and admonitions, and even if he didn't always follow them. But in general, there was this sort of, he was an attentive student or disciple of Settembrini. Now, in these later episodes, Hans is he's self-confident to the point of rebelliousness. He contradicts Settembrini openly. He gives ironic replies. He almost retorts. He even fights Settembrini with Settembrini's own phrases. For example, this quote, "Placet experiri." It's a good example. It's Latin, and it means it is good to try, or one may try. And this was originally a phrase used by Settembrini in a very early episode to encourage Hans to gain experience, to try things out actively, and not to judge in advance or deny himself the experiences. And now Hans throws this phrase back into the face of Settembrini when Settembrini tries to criticize Hans for playing solitaire for hours. So Hans uses Settembrini's own words against him as a sign that he has clearly emancipated himself, that he is no longer the passive recipient of the pearls of wisdom that Settembrini likes to offer. So that is a broken influence here, and one could say that not the influence of Settembrini, but also one of Nafta has been broken. That's not a dramatic sudden turning away. As I mentioned, it has something that has developed also through the previous episodes. It's a creeping distancing, and now we reach the point where it becomes very obvious, very evident. So Hans no longer takes Settembrini seriously, or at least not by far not as serious as he used to. And the same is true with regards to Nafta. Both educators, as the narrator sometimes called them, or pedagogues, both have lost their authority over Hans. He no longer needs them. He no longer follows them. But he hasn't found a replacement either. So the mentors have been dethroned, sacked, but the student has not become a master himself. He is just disillusioned, almost a bit sarcastic and obstinate. Okay, let's try to wrap it up, sort of an attempt to make a summary. The core thesis. First, the relationship triangle transforms from erotic rivalry to something, an alliance based on charity rather than on eros. Hans overcomes his jealousy, at least outwardly, and he becomes an ally of both Clawdia and Peeperkorn. To poison functions as a double motive. On the one hand, as a remedy, but on the other hand, Paracelsus, the dose makes the poison, also as a cause of death. And Peeperkorn's death by snake venom, it is the dark side of his worship of nature. It's a symbol of that old commonplace that too much, even of something good, can prove fatal in the long run. Number 3, impotence manifests itself in many ways, at least in 2 ways. Physically, impotence in Peeperkorn, intellectual impotence in Settembrini and after. Neither physical nor mental strength triumphs here. Both prove to be very limited. Number 4, Peeperkorn chooses the logical exit strategy. His suicide is logical within his worldview and within his philosophy of life. If one can no longer do justice to life, no longer fulfill the demands of life, continuing to live would be a disgrace for him. And number 5, Hans falls into stagnation after losing all his loved ones and all his points of reference, his mentors. He reaches a sort of a dead end. It's a life without time, without hope, without activity, without meaning, without anything. Number 6, the Berghof mirrors the world. So the atmosphere of dullness and also an increasing irritability at the Berghof corresponds to the situation in the political and society situation in Europe. So it's a microcosm of the declining pre-war society with its growing societal and political tensions. And from the academic literature at this point, that like Joachim, also Peeperkorn fails because of his one-sidedness. So both extremes, the Apollonian and the Dionysian extreme, they lead to failure, to death. Only the intermediate position, what the ancient philosophers or theologians called the golden mean or the golden middle road, so via media aurea, and this is embodied by the mediocre character Hans. Only this survives in the end. To summarize even more succinctly in 1 or 2 sentences, these episodes mark the end of Hans Castorp's educational project, and all attempts have failed. Settembrini's humanistic enlightenment and Nafta's radical metaphysics and Peeperkorn's Dionysian vitalism and Joachim's Apollonian submission to discipline, rules, and structure, all has failed. Nothing has convinced Hans, and so what remains is a great emptiness, a great dullness, a dead life. How can things go on now? Something must happen, and something will happen. So in the next episode, a great art and a great medicine for soul will enter the stage, and I'm talking about music. So in the next video, we will deal with the episode Fullness of Harmony. So this is a completely different world. Now, music comes to the fore. A gramophone makes its way into the Berghof, and Hans discovers a new passion for listening musical records. And the episode will be about certain pieces of music that are described and that particularly fascinate Hans, like Verdi's Aida, Bizet's Carmen, Schubert's Am Brunnen vor dem Tore, der Lindenbaum. Thomas Mann himself was a passionate music connoisseur, and this chapter is, in a way, also his declaration of love for music. And I have something special planned for the upcoming video in this episode. I will have a talk in this episode. I will not be alone. I have a talk with a professional musician who will help me explore the musical aspects of this episode. I'm not a musician myself. I would like to have an expert support here, and I got it. And I'm excited about this. I'm particularly excited about the passages about the opera Carmen, because already in this episode, in one of these episodes we've been talking about today, there's a passage where in one of the meetings between Hans and Peeperkorn, Hans gives a short summary of the plot of the opera Carmen, and so he reflects on this disappointed lover who stabs his beloved one, and that should make us really curious. So what is simmering beneath the surface here of Hans? Are there some suppressed impulses, some violent fantasies that come to the fore here? I don't know. Or is that just over-interpretation? We'll talk about this next time. Until then, I hope you have a great reading time. Take care. Bye bye and ciao.